Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung, Earthlets, and welcome to the latest of the 2000 AD Thrillcast's lockdown tapes. I am your host, Molch-R. I hope that you're all staying safe and aren't going too crazy in a lockdown. On this episode, we've got a lovely long chat with David Roach, who is not only a 2000 AD artist of some renown, but also the author of the Masters of British Comic Art, which is out now from treasuryofbritishcomics.com. as well as those bookstores that are still open and comic book stores that are still open. It's also available digitally. Now, this is a just absolutely stunning book, which takes a look at the history of comics from a British perspective, but also focuses in on those artists who have moved the medium forward, perhaps are forgotten. Their legacy isn't as well known as it should be. There's names in there that you'll know, there's names in there that you don't. It's absolutely exquisite. It's taken a lot of work to get it into the shape that it is, which is a massive chunk of Prime Comics beauty. So I chatted away to David for quite some time, which was absolutely fantastic, and I hope you enjoy it. Hope you discover something new. Get your copy of the Masters of British Comic Art, because I've got history books on the shelves here behind me, but there's stuff in these books that even I didn't know. So yeah, absolutely fantastic. We're going to continue to bring you more episodes of the lockdown tapes over the coming weeks. We've got some absolutely cracking interviews lined up, plus some deep dives. I hope you enjoyed the one about Case Files 35. We're going to be doing more of those. And as I said before, if there's any themes or guests that you would like to see us, hear us interview, then drop us a line at thrillcast@2000ad.com. That's thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad. Without further ado, let's crack on and chat to David Roach about not only the Masters of British Comic Art, but also his career at 2000 AD.
We're going to move on to talking about your wider career and your love of comics, but the reason we're chatting is because of the Masters of British Comics Art, which is this gorgeous, thick tome that arrived in the office to much fanfare, it must be said. Tell us a little bit about how this project came about.
It's one of those things where it was a project, in a way, that took 30 years to do, or 35 years, because I've just been collecting and cataloguing British comics for all this time. And for the last 20 years, I've written about a book a year, as well as drawing comics for a living. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a book for Dynamite in America called Masters of Spanish Comic Art. And genuinely, I was walking to the shops one day, and I just thought, well, hang on, I've written a book about Spanish artists. Why don't I do one about British artists? It really was as simple as that. So I put a proposal together, just sort of for fun, wrote out a list of the artists I thought could be in the book. I sent it off to Dynamite, never heard back. I thought, why don't I try Rebellion? I've worked for 2000 AD since I was 21, so it seemed perfect somehow. And Ben from Rebellion wrote back straight away and said, this is exactly the sort of book we'd like to do, incredibly. And it tied in with Rebellion buying up IPC's entire back catalogue. That hadn't happened at the time when I put the proposal in. It was one of those peculiar moments where the timing was just somehow absolutely perfect, and I simply had no idea this was going to happen. And Ben had my Spanish book anyway, so he knew that I could come up with the goods, hopefully.
Tell us a little bit about the book, because it's not just focusing on the history of comics. It is about these key artists who have, I guess, moved the industry forward over the past well more than a century now, haven't they?
Yeah. Well, it is about the big names that everybody knows, the people that moved the industry forward. But it's also about artists that absolutely nobody's heard of, which was part of the appeal for me, because along with my friend Steve Holland, we've been cataloguing all genres of British comics, which embraces girls' comics, romances, nursery comics, that sort of thing as well. So there is this sort of rich diversity, which for decades and decades was drawn by the most extraordinary artists who were never allowed to sign their work. So these were names that people simply didn't know. I mean, many of them have taken me decades to discover as well. And in fact, one of the most poignant pages in the book is an artist who we've just had to list as unknown, because after all this time, I still don't know who the artist is. And that sort of stands in for all the many people whose names we don't know and may never know, which it is absolutely tragic, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's often in discussion about the early days of 2000 AD, the fact that 2000 AD was one of the first comics, not necessarily the first, but one of the first to regularly name its creative lineups, and that was, I believe, Kevin Neal. That was one of his particular bugbears. But that comes, I guess, to a certain extent in the. I don't want this to sound derogatory or anything like that, but the twilight of the industry. So 2000 AD and Battle and Action come along in the late 1970s, and within a decade and a half, the comic book industry, as we knew it in the UK, the newsstand industry has all but disappeared, with only a handful of titles left. So we're talking about well over a century of anonymous work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah.
Are there particular, we're talking about people who nobody knows who they were, but are there ones in particular that really stand out to you as people who deserve recognition but never got it in their lifetimes?
Yeah, very much so. One of the people I absolutely adore that I wanted to include was a girls artist called Leslie Otway, who never signed his work. And his work is just so seductively appealing. It's so beautifully rendered and slick. And he worked for 30 or 40 years drawing girls' comics. He was the first romance artist in this country as well. Probably about 30 or 40% of the people in the book fall into this category. There's another fantastic artist called Paddy Brennan, who worked for DC Thompson's. He worked on all the major Thompson papers, but for me, his best work was his girls' work, drawing primarily for Judy. And he could cram, 20 characters into a single panel. Didn't stint at all. It was the most extraordinary detailed work. The anonymity extends to practically every DC Thompson's artist, of course, because they never gave credits, or at least until the end of Starblazer, which was, I think, the first of their comics to give credits. Also, though, I was keen to, I fancifully said that I was creating this new pantheon of greats, as it were. So if someone was, let's say, a great fan of comics from France or Italy or Spain, if they wanted to find out what British comics were all about and only knew someone like Brian Bolland or Dave Gibbons, where would they go? So that was at the back of my mind as well, to create a book where you could pick it up and just say, well, this is British comics with all the great sort of span of genres and styles. And there were artists that I grew up reading who I thought were in danger of becoming a little bit overlooked. And I hope he wouldn't mind me saying so, but I would include someone like Gary Leach, in that list, who was absolutely one of my heroes when I was starting to try to draw comics, and hasn't really drawn for mainstream comics for 20 or 30 years now, but whose work is so fantastic. He absolutely deserves to be placed alongside all these fan favorites. And I think I've got a lot of his work in the book, and I don't make any apologies for it. And I think it looks really outstanding. But it was for people like that as well.
One thing flicking through the book is the sheer breadth of genres, the sheer breadth of comics that were being produced in the heyday, you know, well up to the 1980s. Was that a challenge for you in terms of what you left in? You know, what you focused on?
No, the challenge wasn't what I put in. The challenge was who I left out. That was always going to be the problem with this book. I knew straight up. I had no problem making a list of people I thought should be in it. And in fact, one of the interesting things that happened in the process of the book was I had an idea that it would be, let's say, 272 pages long, like so many of my books typically are. And I had a list which I'd sent to Ben and Keith, who was editing the project. And Ben came back to me and he said, you know, let's not worry about page count right now. If you want to put more people in, you can put more people in. So actually that began a process of going back and forth with Ben and Keith, with them throwing names to me that they thought should be in it. So it sort of expanded like that. And then I think we reached a point where I could absolutely stand by every name in the book, and I was happy with who was there. We had a really as diverse a group of creators as we could find. And certainly Ben was very key in pushing me towards that. Though the history of British comics is primarily white male artists, and there is no getting around that. But certainly as I was putting the book together, other people would send me names of people who they thought should be in. I know Dave McKean said to me, well, you can't put this book out without Raymond Briggs in. And I had done the book without Raymond Briggs in it, but I put in a cover of one of his books. And then yesterday, Brian Bolland, who very kindly did the cover for me, he said that he got the book, and where was John Ryan of Captain Pugwash fame? And I thought, oh, blimey, I hadn't really thought of putting him in.
I guess that's a bit of a Sisyphean task, though, that no matter who you put in, there's always going to be somebody that someone will say, well, surely they should be in. Were there any particular surprises for you from that process of people suggesting creators to include? Were there any that you didn't know, and when you saw them, you're like, absolutely, they deserve to be in?
There were absolutely. Two names really stand out, and it was more the modern artists than older artists, to be honest. But one was Woodrow Phoenix, who Ben suggested, and he was somebody that I sort of knew from fandom days back in the 80s. He was just sort of a name, and I'd see his work, and we'd be in the same fanzines, but I'd never met him. I knew he was a good artist, but then having to look at his stuff on the internet and see the things he'd done, like She Lives, which is such an extraordinary comic, which is a meter square. Only one copy exists in the world, and you can only see it if you go to an event where Woodrow will open the book and take you through the story. I just thought, that is brilliant. Such a conceptually fantastic idea. The other name, I would have to say, I actually put a request out on Facebook. I said, who is there drawing comics today that you think I should know? And people were just throwing names at me, a lot of which didn't necessarily grab me. I could see they were great talents, but I wanted to be blown away. And then someone said Lorenzo Etherington, or of the Etherington brothers. And I knew them simply because I'd been to conventions where they were at. But you will know what it's like. At a convention, you're stuck behind your table. If you're working for 2000 AD, you're there at the 2000 AD table, and you see people at 9 o'clock and then at 5 o'clock, and you never get to see what's on their table. So I had no idea what Lorenzo's work looked like. I'd say within about 5 seconds of Googling him, I thought, this chap is brilliant. Is absolutely brilliant. It was this gorgeous sort of retro 40s style with so much energy and verve to it, and just fantastic drawing ability. Knocked me out. So he was the biggest discovery in the book for me. I was just blown away.
One thing that I really struck me was when I was a youngster discovering comics in the pre-internet age, the books of Dennis Gifford were an absolute mine of information and things that took me a long time to dig out later. How much was Gifford an influence on how you wrote the book and structured the book?
Dennis was an influence to a degree, but he had a very limited view of what he considered to be great comics. He hated 2000 AD, for a start. That didn't endear him to me. His interest was in things like wartime humor comics, and he loved the Eagle and stuff like that. And I adored the Eagle, but a lot of the humor stuff turns me cold. And he wasn't interested in the girls' comics or romances or anything more recent. So I certainly took a lot from his research. You know, he created the sort of the bedrock of British comics fandom and research. It was more the work that my friend Steve Holland has done in really going into research into the editorial background of the comics. I'm not as interested in characters. I'm interested in the real people that made the comics. So Steve's work was enormously influential and helpful in that sense. But I suppose I have my own interests, my own particular direction. I mean, I come from an illustrative, more of a sort of fine art background in a way. So a lot of the humor stuff doesn't really work for me. I have got a lot of great humor artists in the book, though. Obviously, people like Leo Baxendale and so on. I mean, Ken Reed as well, who's a big favourite of mine. Hunt Emerson too, fantastic talent. One thing I did find though was that you made the point that in a way British comics after 2000 AD were in a much reduced form. And I thought I knew it all. I thought anything from the 80s on would be incredibly easy because that's my era. But nothing could be further from the truth. There's as many British artists working now, it seems, that there ever were, but they're working mostly in America. And there's so much I didn't know. I did more research on the 80s and 90s than I did on the 1890s, far more. There were people like Steve Parkhouse, whose work I knew in Britain and thought he pretty much retired and found there was 20 years of work. Even someone like Cam Kennedy and Kevin O'Neill. I hadn't got everything they'd done in America by any stretch of the imagination. So it was a revelation. It really was.
Is it difficult with a book like this when you're trying to be categorical? You're trying to get a proper sense of the broader industry, of the broader history. Is it difficult to step outside, as you've discussed, of your own taste, of the things that you like, and appreciate that something may not be to your taste, but has nonetheless been a remarkable talent.
Yeah, there were certainly elements of that. I'm not a fan of Dudley D. Watkins particularly, but he had to be in there. I could see that he was great. For the most part, though, if someone is really great in their own particular area, then it does resonate with me. We will see what people say when they get the book. They may well decide that I'm off my rocker, that I've missed out some of the major names, but it was always going to be the case. And as I say, there was a degree of back and forth with people at Rebellion who were suggesting names, and the list got longer and longer as it went on. So I'm going to take 90% of the blame, but there's a group responsibility here. But I think I can vouch for all the art that is in the book, absolutely. One thing we wanted to do was find as much of the scans from original art as we possibly could, and almost all the artists do have work shot from the originals, which is extraordinary after such a, over a century of comic production. So the art in the book looks better than I think it's ever looked in print before. So it's a real sort of feast for the eyes. That was the plan anyway.
One thing that really struck me from your introduction was how you were quite categorical in saying that comic books really are a British medium. Popular culture will have us believe that comic books are an intrinsically American art form, but they had existed in Britain for decades before they evolved in the American context. Do you want to talk a little bit about that history, about that very early history, stretching quite a long way back into the Victorian period?
Oh, way before the Victorian period. I happen to have a book of art criticism called English Graphic by a writer called Tom Lubbock, and he had some examples of Rowlandson's prints. And as I was looking at this, I was thinking, this is a comic strip. Rowlandson was a political satirist, a sort of a cartoonist of the day. And it really made me think, well, what is a comic? So the first thing I have to do is define what a comic is. Some people think it goes back to the work of Hogarth, creating multiple paintings which go together to make a story. But Rowlandson was drawing 6 scenes from a little story, and some of them would even have dialogue balloons on as well. And I thought, well, this is a comic strip, multiple images on the same page with dialogue, telling a story. And this was something like 1790. The book's behind me. I can't quite check it right now, but it was way before the Victorian era. So I think, aha, that's it. We can point to that. And there were titles in Scotland that were coming out that had comic strips in. This is sort of 1830s. We had an enormous industry by the late Victorian era of multiple titles that were coming out weekly. They were called story papers or comic papers, as opposed to newspapers. In many ways, they were half the price of a newspaper. So a lot of their audience would have been adults who couldn't quite afford the penny each day it would cost to buy the Daily Mail or what have you, but they could buy the comic papers for a halfpenny. So we have an enormously rich background, but it seemed to be unknown, unheralded. The Americans always said it was a uniquely American art form, like jazz and rock and roll. And I thought, no, I'm taking it back. It was us.
Touching on that for a second, I never ascribed to concepts of British exceptionalism, but why do you think it was an art form that originated in Britain or the British Isles? And why did it flourish? I mean, you mentioned satire there. Now, obviously, things like Punch, Ali Soper, those great icons of the 19th century comic book. But also, you touched on something that was really interesting, which I think Pat Mills has talked an awful lot about, which is comic books as a working class medium. So do you want to talk about why you think it was in the British Isles, in England and Scotland, the comic book was a form that was invented and did well?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer. Pat is right to a degree about it being a working class medium. I know that when Amalgamated Press was sold, which would have been in the late 50s, all these groups were sort of brought together. Oddham's and Holton and so on, they were all amalgamated, and it sort of became rebranded as IPC eventually. But at the time of this sort of great merger, it was the biggest publisher in the world, which is quite a thought, isn't it? Certainly in the 50s and 60s, we were bringing in artists from all over the world, the greatest artists from Spain, from Italy, from Argentina. It was that big a market. We even had people like Alex Toth drawing British comics for a short while. I think it must have been a combination of, particularly in the 40s and 50s, a great baby boom. So there was this enormous readership out there. I think it was quite a poor readership for the most part. So books were out of reach, but comics and story papers were so cheap and so prevalent that they could read them. Equally, it was a very literate group of people, children. They could read, they wanted something to read. It wasn't like America. We were years behind America in things, in terms of television and things like that. So there were fewer distractions. I think all those things combined together to create this group of this sort of generation, or multiple generations, that were just desperate for entertainment. And the publishers really tapped into that. They knew what would work. You can see a couple of examples of that where publishers absolutely got it right. I think the first example would be the artist Tom Brown, who was what you would call the first great British comic artist, who was drawing for Amalgamated Press in the 1890s. He only drew comics for really a decade, but his style was so perfectly suited to the humorous stories he was telling that it created the blueprint for British comics for the next 40 years. And you can still see his style in humor comics today to a degree. It was so powerful. And then in the 50s, you would have the Holtons with the Eagle and Girl and Swift and Robin, who created comics that were acceptable for the middle classes. So Eagle was selling 1 million copies a week at its peak. So that was really quite a powerful concept for the Holtons. I suppose the most successful in reaching a mass audience would have to be the D.C. Thompson titles. And I have I think it's in the book, but it was certainly a quote that somebody told me, was that they felt, for their girls' comics, for instance, they were being bought by young girls who would go on to work in the mills and the factories. They never lost sight of who they were being aimed at. So they knew this was sort of a large working class Northern and Scottish audience. They were going to they wanted strips that reflected their lives, but equally strips that had a degree of escapism in them. So they were perfectly aimed at that group. And something like Bunty ran for over 50 years. So you'd have to say they absolutely understood their audience and knew how to cater for them.
What do you think of the fact that in Europe, France and Belgium in particular, where you have the BD, the bande dessinée culture, that is an all ages culture. A lot of people compare it to manga in Japan. Multiple genres, multiple creators, multiple characters, still very alive today.
Yeah.
But very much an art form that's absorbed by all age groups. Whereas in Britain, it is now very much still considered a juvenile medium. You say you're into comic books, and people either start talking about the Avengers, or they think that you mean the Beano and the Dandy. Why do you think that is? Why do you think France had that? France, Belgium had that culture that could be all ages, that accepted as an art form in its own right, whereas it remained rooted in juvenilia in the UK?
I think that's true to a degree, and then it isn't true, because when I was growing up, if you mentioned comics, people just assumed you meant the Beano and the Dandy. Several things have changed recently, I feel. 2000 AD changed a lot. It really did. Certainly, if I speak to people of my age who don't know anything about what I do, and I say I draw comics, they think, wow, well, what do you do? Oh, well, I've drawn for 2000 AD. I've drawn Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd. Wow, people of my generation and younger, they will know Dredd. So I think there is a generational divide in that after 2000 AD, people of my generation that grew up reading it regard it as something that was unbelievably cool and still hold it with enormous affection. People that were older have a very, very negative view of comics, it seems. Certainly, I know people that grew up reading The Eagle. These would be people that were going to public schools, for instance, and they would just accept The Eagle, but anything else was considered just appallingly juvenile and not worthy of reading. In fact, if you were caught with a copy of the Beano in school, they'd sort of tear it up and throw it away. I think an even more significant change happened in the 80s with Alan Moore, who is quite a major presence in the book, despite not really primarily being an artist. Certainly, if I speak to some of my neighbours who've not necessarily read a comic in their life, they will have heard of Alan Moore, and they will know that he wrote comics that were somewhat special. So they'll know Watchmen or V for Vendetta. Certainly this enormous explosion of comics we had in the 80s and 90s was a worldwide phenomenon, but so many of the major creators were British. So I think we can take a lot of credit for that. Yeah, it's a generational thing. I think it's okay to say that you draw comics now. Most people I say it to think it's actually quite cool. Even if they've not heard of me, they'd have heard of some of the comic strips I've drawn. So, yeah, I think it's changing. I really do.
Obviously, this is the masses of British comic art. What do you think has been the impact of British comics on the world? And I'm not just talking in terms of the comics medium, but also wider culture.
We're looking at an enormous sort of schism here, whereas actually in the 60s and 70s, British comics were widely exported or repackaged in Spain and Italy and France. My friend Barry Coker, who runs the Barden agency, he was the agent who would go out and actually sell this stuff. So if you go to Spain and Italy, you will see generations of people that grew up reading The Steel Claw and Mytek the Mighty and things like that. They were everywhere. Some of these countries, like France, even drew their own continuations of these serials, like Janus Stark. There are French Janus Stark strips because it was so popular, and it may have, Lion may have been cancelled over here, but they wanted the strips to continue. But from the 80s on, British comics meant 2000 AD and Warrior and Vertigo and things like that. It just completely transformed the impression of British comics around the world. I think most people in Spain and Italy and France that would have grown up reading these older strips wouldn't necessarily have even known they were British. In fact, most of them weren't drawn by British artists, which is one of the things I do touch upon in the book. They were Jesus Blasco and the Lopez Studio and people like that. But I don't think you can overestimate the impact that Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons and David Lloyd and Alan Davis and people like that have made on world comics. You know, they are just such stars. Simon Bisley as well. I mean, Bisley is just enormous in Europe. He really is. Things like Lobo were colossal hits. So, and even though they're American comics, they're by British creators. You know, it's Alan Grant and Simon Bisley doing Lobo. It's Alan Moore and Brian Bolland doing Killing Joke. And it made such a colossal impression on Europe.
Why do you think that is? What are the values that made it such an incredible export?
Well drawn. I mean, that goes a long way. But I was working for DC in the 90s, and I would speak to some of the editors there about British artists. And the impression they had was really interesting. It seemed to be widely held that British artists could really draw. The assumption was they'd all gone to art school and had these sort of great classical backgrounds, though very few, I think, did actually have that. But they were all weird. That was the thing that all the editors seemed to say to me. And I said, well, you can't think that of someone like Dave Gibbons. But yes, they did. They think that all of them were just sort of weird and peculiar and so different to what they were used to, even though to our eyes, these were the mainstream artists that we grew up reading. That was what comics were. You know, if you look at Mick McMahon, you think, well, great. You know, he was there every week. This is what comics look like. The Americans would look at something like Mick's work or Kevin O'Neill's and just think, what the hell is this? They could see it was good, but they just knew it was strange and different to what they were used to seeing. And we just have generation after generation of more fantastic artists coming out. People that barely drew for British comics at all. Someone like Doug Braithwaite, to me, is just one of the greatest artists working in comics today. That's done so little over here. Brian Hitch as well is a massive star in America now. I think there are people growing up that have been enormously influenced by Alan Davis and Brian Hitch and people like that. So we're getting American artists and Spanish artists as well, who are sort of working in their style. They've become that's influential.
I wanted to ask you about the Spanish connection, because, as you said, your first book was Masters of Spanish Art. Because so many of these artists earn their living by drawing British comics. You know, the most obvious example is Carlos Esquerra.
Of course.
But you know, you get people like Jesus Blasco, and that whole culture of Spanish, Italian, Argentinian artists who, let's face it, were cheap in comparison to British ones.
No.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, that is. I've seen Amalgamated Presses paying in books, and I can tell you that they weren't paid less than British artists. It's a myth that's grown up all this time.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. In fact, having looked at the paying book for Thriller and Air Race and War Picture Libraries and things like that, there was a Spanish artist called Giorgio de Gasperi, who did a lot of the early war covers and worked in British comics for something like 10 years. He was fantastic. There's some of his art in the book. And looking at what he was paid, he was the highest paid artist they had. He was paid more than the British painters like McConnell and D.C. Isles and so on. The Spanish artists were hired. Well, it was the Italians who made the biggest impact in the 50s, but the Spaniards sort of eventually took over. They were hired because British comics was so incredibly popular. There weren't enough Brits to go around. We were desperate for talent. And it turned out there were these amazing artists around the world. So we would have Hugo Pratt and Arturo del Castillo and Solano Lopez and Jesus Blasco, who were the best artists in the world. For the Spanish artists in particular, the pound was so much more valuable than the peseta. They were living like kings working over here. So we had the pick of the best. There's a great story that Barry Koga told me of going over to Barcelona to meet Jesus Blasco, and the door was opened by Jesus's butler. I mean, I'm still waiting for my own butler, by the way. Those were the days.
Oh, brilliant. I love it. I love it. One thing I did want to ask about was, I've seen a lot of people writing over the past sort of decade or so about the rise of the auteur writer in comics. The idea it's the writer who is in charge of the process. You know, I've seen complaints that there aren't as many artists invited to the kind of, you know, the Marvel retreats that they do, where they get all their writers together to decide how things are going to pan out. Do you think that has come that A, there is that imbalance there, and B, that it's come at the cost of the idea of artists as auteurs, because they just do the pretty pictures kind of thing?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, you hear so much, particularly these days, about Neil Gaiman. It will be Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, ignoring the fact there were people that actually drew it. And I know this is something that Brian Bolland wrote about very recently, because there's been such an enormous interest in Killing Joke since it was sort of the tonal guide for the Joker movie. And he pointed to an enormous article in The Guardian, which talked about how brilliant Alan Moore's Killing Joke was. And I don't think he got mentioned at all. I mean, from my point of view, Killing Joke is a decent Batman story with very, very good art. If it was drawn by anybody else, I don't think we'd be talking about it now. It was, the art made such a difference to that project. You know, it was so well done. And art can transform a story. I think a lot of it is that writers write about what they know, and they know about other writers. They don't know how much an artist actually contributes to a comic. So, yes, I think artists, I would say this, I admit, but yes, artists are often overlooked as part of the process. Of course, there are some people in this country who are fantastic auteurs themselves, so Hunt Emerson would be a fantastic example, and Dave McKean as well. He's not only one of our best artists, but he's written some fantastic comics like Cages. But we've not got many in this country. Brian Talbot, of course, is another great example. But no, I mean, in this country, there is still very much demarcation, writers and artists. There aren't too many that do both.
That was one of the things I was going to ask about, was because, as you say, we don't have that many artist writers, whereas in American comics, and you know, in other cultures as well, there's much more of the mixing of the two. Do you think that's because of the nature of the industry? You know, literally the structural makeup of the industry, that each part of it is demarcated in such a strict way?
It could be. It might well be that. I mean, a lot of people have written stuff. You know, Ian Gibson and Jim Bakey, they've written certain strips of theirs. I don't know. For the most part, it doesn't feel like there's time. working in weekly comics, there's a lot to get out. And the deadlines, certainly when I started in the industry, deadlines were unbelievably strict. And you had to, in my case, they tried to get me to draw an episode every 2 weeks. I think I managed it once in my whole career. But of course, we did have these people like Carlos and Bellardinelli, and I think Ian Gibson might have been another one, but Dave Gibbons, certainly. There were people that could do it, that really were that fast. Dave even did his own lettering. But yeah, I mean, and again, British comics were very parochial in the old days, to the extent of whiting out signatures if the artist had dared to put it in. I've got a load of Jesus Blasco pages in my collection. He's one of my great heroes. And almost every other page has got a whited out signature on it. And I know when Kevin O'Neill started putting the credit boxes in, there was a lot of resistance from up above. I think the idea was, well, they would say if the artists were given credit, the readers would think the stories weren't real. Apparently that was, you'd think,
Okay.
oh, somebody drew this? The real reason, I'm sure, was because if the artists became popular, they would ask more money, which is exactly what happened with Don Lawrence when he found out that his Trigon Empire stories were being reprinted all over Europe. He came to them and said, I'm popular. People love my stuff. Where's my money? They say, well, tough. Take it or leave it. So he left it and became a star in Holland drawing Storm. But that was so that shows that the degree of control that the publishers had. So everything was very much demarcated. You're the writer, you're the artist. You can't ever talk to each other. We won't give you credits. And you will do your work every week. Bang, bang, bang. Have it in on time. It was extraordinarily strict and almost Victorian in the working details.
With this book, is it? And I realise I'm creating a binary on purpose here. Is it a post-mortem of what was, or a foundation for the future, for what the best of now and the future is bright kind of thing?
Definitely not a post-mortem at all. No. The book is split up into 3 main sections. So the first third is a history of comics. So I'm dealing with what's happened. The second is this sort of gallery of greats, as it were. 100 years of artists, and you've read about their careers, you're able to put them in some sort of context. The last third, or last quarter, let's say, is what I call the modern masters. So it's people that are working now. And I don't think you would look through the book and think, oh, well, the last bit is worse than the first bit at all. If anything, it shows that there is a continuity of brilliance, as it were. There are so many people in the last quarter, like Steve Pugh and Henry Flint and Mike Perkins, Lorenzo Etherington, all these different Tula Lote, all these really diverse styles, who are still but artists that are still working to an extraordinarily high standard. And we have people like Rob Davis and Disraeli, who are creating images that are totally different from anything that's been before. But perhaps there is maybe underneath it all that same British sensibility, even though the styles are different. There's an irreverence, there's a creativity to it all. No, I think looking at the last quarter, you're just struck by the diversity, but the sheer skill of these artists. So I definitely see the book as a celebration and it's pointing to the future as well. I've come away from the project feeling enormously positive about sort of the current generation or generations that are coming through. I would say particularly at 2000 AD, but I might be accused of bias there.
I want to go all the way back to the beginning of this process for you, because you said that this book and your book about Spanish artists comes out of your desire to catalogue all comics.
Yeah.
Why?
Possibly because I had no friends. Was very bad at sport. I mean, there is a collector's mentality, so that might be part of it. Equally, there must be some sort of bizarre personality defect that I have, that I always want to know everything about a topic. So, I mean, when I started collecting music, I'd be buying Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and all these bands that were big before my time. And I wanted to buy every record they'd done, and I wanted to read about them. I wanted to know, well, how does this all fit together? How can I make sense of this music I'm listening to? And it was absolutely the same with comics. I can remember when I bought 2000 AD #1, and it didn't have credits. And I look at all the different styles, and I thought, well, I need to know who drew this. It was particularly Invasion. I know I'm always coming back to Blasco. He had a signature, and I just couldn't identify it at all. It was just a squiggle. And I absolutely felt this profound need to know who this artist was and to see more by them. And it was the same when I bought my first girls' romance comic, which I found in a comic shop in Norwich with half the pages missing. But I could see there were 3 or 4 strips in it that were really good. And one of them looked like the artist that drew Vampirella, that I was a big fan of. And I thought, well, how can this be? There's a connection here that I couldn't understand. So I just wanted to find out more and more. And just how does it all work? How does it fit together? And who were these people? You know, clearly they were artists that cared enormously about their work. I mean, one of the artists in the book is someone called Gordon Hutchings, who drew a strip called Gulliver Guinea Pig. Now, if you go to any self-respecting comic fan, there's no way they are going to get excited about a strip like Gulliver Guinea Pig. This was something that was aimed at the under 5s and designed to be read out to them by their parents. The under 5s are not a very demanding audience, you would imagine. But Gordon Hutchings and so many of these early nursery artists really cared about what they did. The work is exquisitely painted, beautifully drawn, quite avant-garde and surreal. And the idea that there were people like Hutchings or Bob Dewar, who created amazing artwork for DC Thompson's, that clearly were great creative forces, but were unknown. It felt wrong. It felt like there was a great injustice here, and that they deserved to be celebrated for what they did. Another one of my frustrations was that I tried for years to contact some of the artists represented by the Kearley agency. So these were people like Shirley Bellwood and Pat Tourette, who I loved. And I would speak to the agency and I would say, well, we have these conventions, and if Shirley turned up to one of the conventions, she would have fans. There would be people there that grew up reading Misty that would love to meet her. And the agent would say, no, I'm not going to pass your details on. You cannot contact them. They won't be interested. So these people have died now without ever knowing that their work is appreciated. And that is a horrible thing. It really is. So yeah, I mean, the book is about creating a new sense of the history of British comics, and it's also paying tribute to people whose work deserves to be remembered. I think that's as much as anything else. Artists that deserve to be appreciated.
One of the things that has really struck me since we have got hold of the IPC archives, decades and decades and decades, well, more a century of great comics, is aside from the most obvious concern, which is that some of these artists and writers, either they, if they're still alive, or their estate, if they're not, are getting royalties for this stuff for the first time. When we put a book of Leopard of Lime Street out, this is one of the first times that actually they're going to get any money back, and so many of them have died. And so I'm guessing it is about, as you say, an injustice, righting that wrong, giving them the credit that they so richly deserve, for inspiring generations. I mean, look at you and me. We were inspired by our reading habits as children to go into the industry, to contribute in our own way to the whole thing. So that is a hell of a legacy.
Oh, absolutely, profoundly so. And it was something that I've become aware of more in the last 5 or 6 years than I ever had before. I've been going to conventions since the late 70s as a fan, and then as a creator. And I've noticed an enormous change. Recently, people have been coming up in ever increasing numbers. Things like London Film and Comic Convention and Thought Bubble, we were getting thousands and thousands of visitors a day. And they want to come up and say how much your work as a creator meant to them. And we weren't getting that in the 90s, nothing like that sort. But for the most part, these aren't necessarily hardcore comic fans. They're just sort of general readers. But the strips that we drew did seem to mean an enormous amount to them. I have had a few people saying that. I drew Judge Anderson for quite a few years in the 80s, and I had people saying that she was their first crush, which shows the impact that this work can have. Absolutely, yeah. And they're great sort of cultural figures. Some of these creators, someone like Mick McMahon, such a unique talent. And I think really inspired a generation of readers. Absolutely.
Well, we had the movie director Ben Wheatley on the podcast a few years ago, and he ended up working with Mick on storyboards for some of his work, because he had read that stuff when he was a kid. And you've only got to look at someone like Danny Cannon, who directed the first Judge Dredd movie. He had fan art published in 2000 AD when he was younger. So
Duncan Jones is another fanboy.
Of course, yeah, writer and director of the forthcoming Rogue Trooper movie. That was actually a perfect moment to move on to talking about your career. But I do want to kind of loop back a little bit, because you've mentioned romance comics a few times, and we've had so many veteran artists on and writers as well on the podcast who've talked about starting their careers on romance comics. Now, this is effectively a genre that has disappeared, but seems to be thanks in part to an influence from manga and from European comics, seems to be coming back in a significant way amongst this kind of smaller publishers. But let's just talk about that romance genre, because you had as many romance titles as any of the other genres.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it was such a massive money spinner as well, wasn't it?
It was. Interestingly, my mum told me that when she was newly married, she was reading a romance comic, which I've got a few copies of, called Bliss, which was aimed at young newlyweds, if you can believe such a thing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and my mum bought it in 1960. It's quite incredible. I think for the publishers, the romance comics were a real boon, because it was extending the age group of readers. So, the boys' comics typically thought by the time you got to maybe 11 or 12, that was it. You were going to go on to actual books. But the romance comics were aimed at teenage girls, maybe even girls into their 20s. So it was extending the life of the readership. So it was fantastic for them. I mean, one of my great regrets is that the romance genre died out just when I got into the industry, because I would love to have drawn them. It would have been perfect. Though, of course, I would have wanted to draw them in the 60s, when we could have all the fantastic sort of psychedelic backgrounds and groovy fashion. Not quite so interested in drawing it in Thatcher's Britain, which was grey and uninteresting as far as I was concerned.
Ultimately, we're talking about a disposable medium here. So many of these comics printed on relatively poor paper, not always in the bog paper that early 2000 AD seems to have been printed on. But one of my favourite anecdotes was talking to Kelvin Gosnell, I think a year or two ago, and he said on one of the tours of the printing presses, he was told that the only reason they really printed comics was to keep the presses ticking over at night, because if they shut them down, they wouldn't work anymore. And do you think that the disposable nature of the medium, the not just in terms of the physical product, but also, the lack of creator credits and things like that. Do you think that appeals very specifically to the collector's mentality? Rooting through kind of 50p bins in comic book stores and all this, that, and the other, just to find those little gems, almost like going through like long boxes in vinyl record stores. You're looking for the undiscovered thing, the rare thing.
There is an element that, because you had to work to find it, it becomes more meaningful to you. I mean, I know records were like that to me in a way that they're not to my daughters, who've got everything on tap. They just go to Spotify and there's every record ever made. I know when I was collecting Frank Zappa records, it could take you years to find some of them because they were out of print. You'd have to go to record fairs. In comics, actually, one of the peculiar things about British comics, which again is unique to us, I think, is how little collected they were. You have such a dichotomy between the fans that go to comic shops and go to conventions and the collectors of British comics, who always seem to be a completely different group of people somehow. If you think about going to a traditional old comic shops, they were just American comics. And if you go to the shows, the guests that people cared about were the American guests. Even in the 80s, when you had the great big UCAT shows, you didn't have artists from the previous generations. They simply weren't there. If you went to San Diego, you would expect to see Jack Kirby. If you went to UCAC, you wouldn't expect to see Frank Hampson. He didn't go. You wouldn't see Don Lawrence. There was such a schism between comics before 2000 AD and after 2000 AD. It was as if these previous sort of 60 or 70 years worth of production, as if they didn't happen. We were very much, it was like an industry without honor. It really was. Again, that's another one of my reasons for wanting to do the book, to redress the balance, to show there is this continuum of creativity if we did but know it.
One thing we haven't touched on, I guess this is the perfect way to segue into your career, is the influence of fanzines and the underground movements, which began with, to a certain degree, with the counterculture of the 1960s into the 70s and 80s, and it's how you began drawing comics. I understand.
I did, yeah.
You have the very famous figures like Robert Crumb, but also from the British side, somebody like Brian Talbot, who was a self-publishing underground comic book artist, who went mainstream. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you came to be an artist? I mean, was it reading those comics as a youngster that made you want to go into art? Were you naturally artistic as a child?
I was always artistic, but I didn't draw comic strips. It's the most peculiar thing. I went through different periods of things that I wanted to draw. So in primary school, I was crazy about aeroplanes. I mean, maybe it comes from reading war comics when I was growing up. That could well be it. But yeah, I drew aeroplanes until I discovered American comics. Then I would copy my favorite panels. So I would copy people like Jack Kirby. And then as I discovered new types of comics, my art would change. Certainly discovering Vampirella changed the sort of things I drew quite a bit, as you might imagine. But I didn't draw my first comic strip until I was 18, and I put out my own fanzine, which I called Hellfire. I had drawn illustrations for fanzines before that, things like Cerebro and Fancy Advertiser. I was quite involved in early 80s British fandom. I would go to meetups in London. Even I'm from Cardiff, so I was sort of quite apart from the mainstream of fandom. It didn't seem like there was much going on here, unlike now, where there's lots of comic artists that live here. But yeah, I got into comic fandom in quite a big way. And I always had it in my mind that I wanted to be a comic artist. So I went to art college and did fine art, which was not an enormous amount of use to become a comic artist. Mike Collins went to university and studied politics, which was as much use to him as my fine art degree has been to me, really. But yeah, I mean, I got into comics through going to conventions and having work with me. And it was the most peculiar thing, actually. I met Cam Kennedy one day. He doesn't remember this, by the way. And he saw my work and spoke to Steve McManus. And on the second day of the convention, Steve McManus came to me and said, when you get out of art college, send me some samples. And if they're any good, you can start drawing for 2000 AD. So that's it. I did 2 pages of artwork, sent them off to Steve, and he said, okay, would you like to draw Nemesis the Warlock? So my first Nemesis strip, because I'd actually drawn for my fanzine Hellfire, and I'd done 4 strips in the 4 issues of that. The first episode of Nemesis I drew was my 5th ever comic strip, though I had read thousands of comics by that time. But I just liked, I suppose the fine art background is there in me. So I love life drawing and that sort of thing. So the drawing aspect was, I suppose, stronger than the storytelling aspect. So as much as I've loved comics, it's just the act of drawing that I absolutely love. That's the key thing for me. And in fact, these days, where else can you draw exciting things for a living than in comics?
I mean, you say it wasn't much use, but if there's one quality of your style that I think really stands out, is its classical elements. It's clear that you have studied art, because not just the lines you use, but you look at something like Engram in the 1980s, the Judge Anderson series that you drew, and that you can see so much Gothic influence. You can see, I mean, so many different painting styles you could name. is your style something that you settled on, or was it, or did it kind of settle by itself? Because it was interesting what you were saying about your style would change based on what you'd been reading. So you pick up American comics and all of a sudden your style changes. Was the style that you've had, which by and large has remained fairly consistent over the past 30 odd years. Did that kind of settle by itself, or did you choose, right, this is the style that I want to draw in?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think if you ask most artists, they'd say they don't have a style. I mean, whatever comes out is what comes out. Engram is different in a way, in that I really, really wanted to draw as if I was drawing for Vampirella back in the 1970s. So I was so besotted by these Spanish artists like Luis Garcia and Jose Ortiz and Pepe Gonzalez, all of these people that I just idolize, and some of which I've written books about now, you know. I was so totally influenced by them that I sort of absorbed it into my style, or shamelessly ripped off, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, I don't know, because I know so much about comics, and I know so many different artists and so many styles. To me, it feels like I'm constantly being pulled in so many different areas, depending on what I looked at last. I mean, I was enormously influenced by Brian's work because I've spent so long drawing his characters. I still, if I'm drawing Judge Death or Judge Anderson today, I'll still take out the Titan books of those stories and have them on my desk, because that's my touchstone. It may end up looking not like him and more like me, but I'm not necessarily aware of it. I mean, I draw as I draw. If it comes out halfway decent, then I consider that to be a very good day indeed. I don't know how much conscious decision any of us have over our styles. I really don't. Do you think Kevin O'Neill sort of woke up one day and thought, I'm going to draw like this, like nobody else in the history of the world has ever drawn before? No, I think it comes out as it comes out, and it maybe mutates and grows over the years. And so you end up with people like Mick or Kevin that are just so unique. My overriding desire, I suppose, is just to draw as well as I can. I do go to life drawing every week, and I did study anatomy, so that is one of my overriding concerns, to try and draw what I consider well, which you would call the classic style, I guess. And a lot of the artists I look at are older creators. So I look at a French artist called Paul Guillon all the time. His use of light and shade is just fantastic. And I look at Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who draws for DC Comics, these fantastic draftsmen, you know. But it's endless. There's always people, always new names that come through, and I look at, I think, that's how you do it. It never ends. I don't know. I feel like I'm still growing, still sort of reaching for something I can point to and say, I got that right at last. Still trying to get there.
You mentioned Kevin O'Neill there. Of course, as the co-creator of Nemesis the Warlock, his has been the kind of, he is the definitive artist on Nemesis the Warlock, obviously, but there's a fair few. How did you approach that, considering, as you say, it was the fifth comic you'd ever drawn?
Yes.
How do you stand? Are you standing in the shadow of something like that? Was it a challenge? Did you kind of ignore that and do it in your own way, or what was that like?
I was young. I was 21 when I started drawing it, and I was a very young 21-year-old. And for a while, I thought that I was the bee's knees. So I wasn't as intimidated by following Kevin as I should have been. Though in fact I was following Brian Talbot, because this was book 8 by the point that I started drawing it. So there had been other people doing it. Actually, I looked at Jesus Redondo. It was Nemesis book 2, the only one that hadn't been reprinted at that time unfairly. So I loved Jesus's work. And I thought he had a very organic style, which I could perhaps meet halfway. So I was bringing my sort of more realistic drawing style with a few little Spanish elements to it. Maybe a bit of American comics influence as well, possibly. We had these big characters who were fighting each other. There's a lot of that going on. But yeah, it was Redondo that was my way in, though I knew that the only reason I was given the strip, was because it had a girl in it. It was Purity's story, and the emphasis was going to be on her. So Pat wanted someone who was a bit 2000 AD, but a bit girls' comics as well. In fact, I was meant to start off by drawing a Future Shock, but somehow Pat Mills saw my work and said, oh no, don't waste your time doing the Future Shock. It was either Pat or it could have been Steve McManus, actually. It was one of the two. So I was sort of I was waiting for a script for a Future Shock from a young Scottish writer called Grant Morrison, but it never turned up. If it had turned up, maybe I wouldn't have ever drawn Nemesis. I don't know. But it was always going to be a slightly different episode because it was Purity's story. And then I got Judge Anderson, again, because I could draw girls. That if there is a 2000 AD house style, it doesn't involve drawing pretty girls. But that was the one thing that I could do. So I think that was what gave me the chance to draw both these strips.
Let's talk about Judge Anderson for a little bit, because I guess it is the character that you've been most associated with at 2000 AD.
Yeah.
We talked ever so slightly about Engram, which was, I mean, that was a hell of a story by Alan Grant that was delving into Anderson's psyche, was touching on issues of child abuse, both by within the family and also by the institution of Justice Department. What can you remember about how you approached the story? Because I seem to recall there was quite a gap between the two halves of Engram, wasn't there?
There was, but just in the publishing. There was no gap in me drawing it. I was just so slow. And they wanted to get it out. So, I mean, it was meant to run in 12 episodes together, but it was 2 groups of 6 in the end, just because I was taking so long to do it. The first episode of Engram was more or less written by me, actually. I had an idea of how to start the story off, which was Anderson going into the cursed earth, and she's meeting there's all these sort of weird mutants, and there's some sort of child being held up, all this stuff. And I sent the plot off to Alan, and I just said, I have no idea where to go with this. So there's no dialogue. Can you do anything with it? And he liked to have a springboard just to jump off with for the stories. And then he took that and just went with it and gave me all this brilliant stuff to draw. I might have said things like, can you get Judge Anderson in a graveyard? Can you work that in? Which was often how these things worked out. But then I was just drawing it by the seat of my pants, just desperately trying to meet some sort of deadline. But doing it as if I was drawing for Vampirella back in the 1970s. So I was doing all these textures and scratches and that sort of thing, which other artists weren't really doing at the time. I was just totally besotted with the 70s. What can I say? I'm a 70s person.
And what was the attitude of editorial to this? Because I guess you were dealing with Steve McManus at the time.
No, this was Richard Burton.
This was Richard Burton by that point, right? Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what how did he react when? Was it kind of like occasional polite phone calls, just going, how you doing, or was it a bit more forceful than that?
It was a little bit more forceful than that. Back in those days, we didn't really get much feedback, to be honest with you. I typically would send the stuff in and really not hear anything much about it. I know they wanted it more quickly. They really did. And I tried, but I don't know, to reach the sort of standard that I wanted to reach, I knew it was going to take me a long time. I just can't draw quickly. I even have this now in life drawing, in that if we will have quick poses and I'll have an arm done, I know I need 25 minutes to get in a full figure, and I just can't seem to draw any more quickly than that. I think it was Brian actually that said he'd seen Dave Gibbons draw, and Dave's hand was drawing 3 times more quickly than Brian's hand was. It was something as basic as that. All through Judge Anderson, I was speaking to Alan all the time, so it always felt like I was working for him, almost more than working for the editors. Steve McManus was great in the early days when I was working. He gave me a lot of feedback, which I needed, but he left before I started drawing Judge Anderson. I think he was really only there for Nemesis. So for most of my time, I was working with Richard Burton and Alan Mackenzie, and I'm still quite friendly with Alan now. Actually, I see him from time to time. I always like working with him.
What aside from the fact that you can draw women, why do you think you've become so synonymous with a particular era of Judge Anderson in 2000 AD?
It's a mystery to me. It really is. No, I'm so grateful. When my daughters were born, I simply didn't have the time to go to conventions. So there's actually quite a gap when I really wasn't going to conventions at all. I was working in America, and I thought people had completely forgotten me. I really had. I just felt so cut off from the comic scene. So, and it's been wonderful to realize that these strips really did make an impact with the readers, particularly Engram, more than anything else I've done. And it's so weird that in many people's minds, my style is sort of Engram. You know, my career, these sort of 5 years when I was drawing Judge Anderson, which was 30 years ago, but in their minds, that's who I am, which is quite interesting. I think I'm a better artist now, but I think for all of us, it's just great to be remembered, great to know that the work we did made an impact.
I remember you in particular from, my first encounter with it was Triad, which was again, a story that touched on Alan's connection between Anderson's psychic powers and the abuse and the trauma that she'd suffered. And in particular, I think that was a story where it was the Burns night supper at the beginning, and the massive ram bursts through the wall and says, "Burns night, I'll give you Burns," and then sets everybody on fire. Which I think I must have been about 9 or 10 when I maybe a little older than that when I first saw it. And to be quite frank, it scared the living bejesus out of me. So thanks for that.
My pleasure.
But I kind of want to come back to this notion of the Gothic, because some of the work that you've done for American comics was Batman, which all the characters, I guess, that in American comics that I would have thought your style was perfectly suited towards it would be Batman. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came about?
The chronology of it all is a little bit vague to me now. I think I started working for Dark Horse first, and I was drawing Star Wars. But certainly I was in contact with Alan Grant all this time, and he must have said to me, I will write you a Batman story, which he did, which was Batman Demon, which was set in hell and had all sorts of really crazy stuff going on. I even drew Margaret Thatcher in hell before she was dead. Quite prescient there, I think. And that just took forever. It really did. It was a sort of a graphic novel thing that's actually been reprinted around the world, but never reprinted in the English language, strangely. But in a way, that was still like drawing for 2000 AD because I was working with Alan. But my career changed after that point because I began to get a lot of work from DC as an inker, because I'm so slow drawing, but I am very quick at inking, particularly inking other people. So I actually was a regular inker on Batman and other DC comics for quite a few years. And I was just working for DC pretty much all through the 90s. DC, Dark Horse, Topps, and then Wildstorm and Warner Brothers did things for them. Just all sorts of odd things that came up, which very few people in this country ever seem to have seen. It was as if they must have thought I died, I would imagine. I mean, Star Wars, I drew the second ever new Star Wars series, as it were, after the original Marvel series died. And Cam Kennedy did Dark Empire. I did Tales of the Jedi, which is the second comic from Dark Horse. And it sold 250,000 copies. It was the most rare thing I've ever done. And yet I never see anybody that's ever read one. It's bizarre. But, you draw for 2000 AD, people remember you forever. It's amazing. But yeah, I didn't get back into British comics until the year 2000. So there's this big gap there.
Well, I wanted to ask about your experience of American comics, because as you said, you were drawing them, but one of the themes of our conversation has been the speed at which you're able to draw.
Yes.
And American comics being larger, yes, they're monthly, but they rattle along at a breakneck speed. Did that cause you problems, I suppose?
Well, not for inking. No, it was the
not for
easiest.
inking.
Yeah, it was the easiest thing in the world. I mean, for Tales of the Jedi, I was meant to be in issues 1 and 2. I ended up being in issues 4 and 5. The Batman Demon comic, well, it was a one-off, so it actually didn't matter how long I took. I did an issue of Lobo, but which Alan Grant wrote again. But I only did the first 6 or 7 pages. He was clever enough just to give me a few, I suppose drawing for 2000 AD, I'm just used to thinking in 6-page chunks. That feels like the natural way to draw. If you're drawing 20 pages of a story, it just seems like, wow, that's such a massive undertaking. But inking, I can do a page a day, page and a half. The most I've ever done is 3. So I think the detail that you expect in British comics really does stand you in good stead for American comics, because we're used to producing work that's really, really sort of texturally dense. So yeah, that was a big help. I got to ink people like Jim Aparo on Batman that I grew up reading, so that was a real treat. Getting to speak to Jim on the phone and hearing this voice that sounds like a mafia boss, just the most gravelly voice you can possibly imagine. I mean, I'm a fanboy at heart. I'm a fanboy that draws. So getting to work with all these characters was just fantastic fun. It really was.
Looping back into the whole question of Masters of British Comic Art. I've seen it commented on that now we're in an age where the people who are in charge, the people who are producing content, are fans. They're people who grew up with this. Do you think that's fundamentally changed the nature of comics from just being, as we explored earlier, a job, something that people did to pay the bills, and made it much more of a personal thing? It's a vocation now rather than necessarily just a job in illustration kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that you would have an artist like Shirley Bellwood, for instance, whose agent would feel that they wouldn't want to talk about comics, they wouldn't want to meet their fans, they were almost ashamed of it. You can't imagine anybody saying that now, can you? I mean, the number of people I see at shows that want to show me their work, it's almost as if everybody that reads comics wants to get into them. Yeah, we love it. We absolutely love it. And that does change the nature of the work that's published, of course, but equally, I think there's a sense that the audience has grown up with us, so that they will accept someone like Disraeli, for instance. I don't think he would have had work back in the 60s or 70s. I really don't. People, they'd look at his work and just think, well, what is this? You know, they wouldn't even begin to know what they were looking at. Or someone like Tiernan Trevelyan, who's another great sort of stylist, or Henry Flint, whose work is just out there, you know. Yeah, I think because there are people like Matt, who's editing 2000 now, or all the people working in American comics, they've got a broader sense of what comics can be, I think. So that allows maybe a broader span of styles and approaches than we had before. But there does seem to be an audience for it as well. I mean, someone like Henry is a real fan favorite, despite doing some work which is just uncategorizable. And, you know, Mick and Kev are, you know, they're adored by the fans. So no, I think it's great. I really do. And things have definitely changed. Yeah.
Well, we had Mike Dorey on the podcast the other week, and one of the things he said was that, you know, he went to a show and people knew who he was and wanted to get things signed, and he's just worked with Garth Ennis on the Action Special, and Garth is a massive Battle in Action fanboy, and he's like, oh, you remember me? You like my stuff? Oh yeah, says the writer of Preacher. You know, it's that kind of thing. Unless you're in contact with it, you don't necessarily understand just the impact that you're having. With your career, and there's a few other things I want to touch on still, but looking back at the variety of things you've done, you've been you were a stalwart of 2000 AD for a number of years, went off to become an inker in American comics. Since 2000, you've returned to 2000 AD and done bits and bobs for us. What's your own view, looking back on the career that you've had so far, about, you know, the kinds of work you've done? Has it played out in a way that you thought it would? Or
I mean, one thing I should mention is that the Masters of Spanish Comic Art wasn't the first book I wrote. I was putting together a bibliography last year, and well, the new one is the 26th book that I've written or co-written. So, and I've written for magazines and things. That I've done an enormous amount of writing about comics, and I've done storyboards as well. I do a lot of what I call sort of fine art drawing in my spare time. I mean, I think a lot of people that have bought my books have no idea I'm the same person that draws comics, because I've written about illustration and World War II artwork and all this sort of stuff. I don't know, can you have any sort of control over your career? Things just happen. In the last 20 years or so, when I've pretty much just been working in British comics, I don't think I've ever actually asked for work. It's always been things that have come to me. And every year I want to draw something for 2000 AD, and I pretty much have done every year. I will say the biggest moment for me as a comic artist was being asked to draw for Prague 2000. That meant so much, it really did. And I knew that I was going to be in the same issue as all the greats. It was like, there's all the greats of 2000 AD and me and Rufus. It was so bizarre, but I put my all into that strip, and it was the best thing I'd drawn up to that point by quite some way, because I was doing all these panels that looked like my fine art drawings. I really wanted to make a splash. And it was such a successful comic, 3 printings, national tours, signings. It was incredible. It was the moment where I thought I might finally have sort of arrived after decades of being in the industry. But the idea that you can put together some sort of career, I mean, everything just seems to be pure chance. The strip I'm drawing now, called Sapphire, which I'm working with Keck W on. It simply came about because at a convention last year, I went to find my friend Dylan Teague, who I draw with every week, and we worked in studios together over the years. And Dylan was talking to this chap with a sort of West Country accent. And Dylan said, "Oh, do you know Keck?" No, never met him. And we got talking, and we communicated after the convention. And we thought, well, why don't we do something together? What would you like to draw? What would you like to write? Pure chance. We come up with an idea. We sent it to Matt. He said, well, it'll probably not work, but I'll give you a 3-parter, which we're doing now. I've never enjoyed drawing anything more. I'm just having the time of my life drawing it. But pure chance. And I just, because so many things just seem to come up, thankfully, commissions as well, and doing work for Doctor Who magazine, which I've drawn or inked on for 20 years now. And that's led to doing work for a Doctor Who computer game, which I spent the best part of a year drawing art for that. There's just, I don't think you can plan these things. There doesn't ever seem to be a break where I can say, what am I going to do now? What would be a good career move? I'm going to be drawing for Germany as soon as I finish drawing Sapphire. Again, that was just somebody that was just liked my work and said, hey, how would you like to draw this? There's just no way of knowing. And actually doing commissions for fans, some years that takes up as much time and creativity as drawing the strips. That's become an enormous part of my career, and lots of other artists, I think. Being on Facebook, I post stuff every day, and there are people around the world that now know my work that have never heard of 2000 AD. So there's always sort of new ways to find an audience. But planning a career, does anybody? I don't know. It's just whatever's happened has happened.
Well, I guess my next question kind of feeds into that just slightly about your working day, because over the past 15 years of interviewing artists and writers, I've come across a remarkable breadth of ways that people work. And so people are very structured, people who aren't very structured. As somebody who doesn't just draw, but also writes and researches, and as you say, you post both comic book art and fine art and illustration on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
What makes up your day? How do you fill your day, or is it literally kind of organic? What is coming up?
It is very organic, but a typical day will be once I've actually woken up and had breakfast. Well, particularly at the moment, I'm going for a walk first thing, because what else is there that we can do? So I always try to exercise to a degree every day. I'm going for, I live in I'm sort of on the outskirts of Cardiff, so we've got lots of green areas around me. So I'm walking around the lake or something like that every day. And then I go into my studio and I basically work until 10 or 11 o'clock at night every day. And I think for a lot of artists, that can be the same. I am slow. So if I want to get stuff done, I just have to put the hours in. Then when I've finished, I'll go online. I don't have a computer in my studio, so I'm very much cut off. It's just me and 10,000 comics and piles of artwork around me, tempting me away from the drawing board. But no, I'll go online at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and we'll answer emails, do some writing, post stuff, and that can go on, particularly when I'm writing my books, that can go on until 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And then the books, if there's a lot of writing that needs to be done, that will be done in between episodes of whatever I'm working on. So it's just it's juggling, constantly juggling. And I've got a list of commissions, which is about 50 long at the moment. And I've got people's sketchbooks that are waiting for drawings. And it's always, what's most desperate? What do I have to do now? Very organic, but intensive. We're all living in lockdown now. But I would guess for most of us artists, there's actually not that much difference to our usual lives, because we do pretty much spend it all sat behind the drawing board. I know there are some artists that would work very set hours, and it would be, I think it was Ron Smith that would work 9 to 5, and he would do a page a day. And at 5 o'clock, that page was finished, which is amazing. And you look at how detailed his stuff was. I mean, I'm a big fan, but to be able to do so much every day in such a confined, precise amount of time, I certainly can't work like that. No.
In my notes, I always refer to it as the legend of the egg timer. Because he would set the egg timer and put it on his board.
It was an egg timer, was it?
Yeah, and when that went off, that page was done.
It was done, but it would be good.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember I interviewed him years ago, and he said, he'd put his daughters to bed, and then at if he had an extra half an hour, he might go and sort of tidy things up and do a little bit more. But that would be his own time that he would be investing in that. That wouldn't be work time. Absolutely fascinating chap, about the way. But I'll be honest with you, that notion of the again, I always use the phrase journeyman, even though I know it's not the right phrase. That disciplined illustrator who treats illustration, who treats drawing comics like an office job. And you had those generations of artists and writers who did a 9 to 5. It's just that they either did it in a studio with other artists, or they did it at home in their study. For me, there's something terribly romantic about it, as somebody who cannot keep office hours at all.
I've got an enormous amount of respect for people like Mike Weston, or Eric Bradbury, or Jeff Campion, or Joe Colquhoun, who are artists that would turn it in every week for decades. I mean, did Joe Colquhoun ever miss a deadline? Did Mike Weston ever miss? I bet they didn't. But they were producing amazing artwork week after week after week, just to have that discipline and that the quality of their work. Even Frank Bellamy, who I think was our greatest ever artist, he was able to do a weekly strip. There were occasionally gaps in between them, but he did Thunderbirds pretty much every week for 5 years solid, and produced the greatest artwork this country's ever seen at the same time. That's really something. To be fast, to be good, and to stay inspired. Now that is a real trick. I mean, I was lucky to have entered comics when I did, that there were other slow artists around me. I mean, the people that I looked at the most at 2000 AD were definitely Brian and Gary Leach. They're the people whose my style is sort of closest to, and they were both unbelievably slow. But there were enough artists working on the comic that you could accommodate that. So you would have people like Carlos and Bellardinelli and Ian Gibson, who were, you know, just fast, could do it. They were sort of like Dave Gibbons as well. They were the backbone of the comic. You knew you could rely on them. They would turn in quality artwork, a page a day, pretty much. They would have to have done. And then there were others who were the more sort of, I don't know, dilettantes, perhaps. But they were open enough to different approaches that they would accommodate that just about. I don't think I was ever Richard Burton's favourite artist, I'm sorry to say, but he never fired me. And for that, I am very grateful.
You've been able to work on 2000 AD. You've had stuff in US comics. You've worked quite extensively on Doctor Who, as you said.
A lot, yes.
Is there something? Is there a pinnacle you've yet to reach that you would love to? Is there a character, a story that you hope that you will be able to work on one day?
Less so now than I used to have. I mean, my favourite comics character is Vampirella. And I have drawn Vampirella for Dynamite in America. I've done a series of covers for them. I've written numerous books about her and her artists, and I've done loads of drawings for fans of Vampirella. So I've done her. I think just the opportunity to draw something that I'm pleased with. So the Sapphire strip I'm doing at the moment is it really is the most fun I've ever had. I think it's the best art I've produced. And I'm just working with a great writer who's just off on his own planet, which, you know, is what you want. You want to have fun things to draw, and he's definitely creating that for me. And I'm working for really nice people at 2000 AD and Panini on Doctor Who. That makes an enormous difference, knowing that your work is appreciated. And if the fans like it, well, what more could you ask for? So I'm not as, and, you know, yeah, it was everybody's dream to draw Judge Dredd. And I loved drawing Judge Dredd and Judge Anderson. But I have done it. I mean, so I've drawn my Dredd strips. So that's sort of out of the way in a way. I mean, if they want me to draw Judge Anderson again, I'll be happy to do it, as long as they don't want it quickly.
Kind of coming to the end of our chat, I think. But there's something kind of about the nature of art, because you clearly have a love of art, of all types of illustration. You know, not just posting stuff, not just working, but a deep understanding of how it can influence people. What do you think is the essence of your passion for art? Where is this drive to know it all, to want to understand it all coming from?
Well, there's a question. I wasn't expecting that. I've always drawn. I don't really know how to explain it. It's funny, I'm interested in so many other artists, and the only one that I'm not interested in is myself. I mean, I live with myself all the time. I just do what I do. I don't know, it's a compulsion. If you looked at my sixth form exercise books in school, there is practically no writing in them at all. They are just covered in drawings. I know that the teachers would take them in just to look at my drawings and, become appalled at how little I was taking in of what they were saying, I think. I don't know, it's a compulsion. I just love it. I mean, in my spare time, I draw these colossal life drawings that take a week to do each picture. If I could make a living doing that sort of fine art, I would love it. I adore comics, but just the pure act of drawing is just so wonderful. Much more so than telling a story, really. It's just the drawing aspect of it, but a complete compulsion and an obsession. I never stop being interested in art. I read about it. If I'm watching television, it'll be a program about art. It's just everything. Just completely informs my whole life. As a kid, we went on holiday. I'd always want to go to the local art gallery just to look at the art there. And I went to every bookshop and comic shop and second-hand shop looking for hidden treasures. An obsession.
If people want to find you online, where do they need to go to savour some of this incredible art?
Put in David Roach in Facebook, and there I am. Just my little avatar is a face of Judge Dredd. I thought that was much more palatable for people to look at than my face. And I should say as well that I intended to get a haircut for months and months. I intended to get my haircut, and now I can't. So I'm sitting here looking even more straggly and scruffy than usual.
You'd be glad to know that the vast majority of the people who listen to the podcast do so audio only. So, that's...
Well, thank goodness for that.
David, I want to thank you for that. That was absolutely fantastic. Wonderful chat. I'm really looking forward to seeing people discover the Masters of British Comic Art, because it's such a... it's a beautiful artifact, not in of itself, never mind all the wonderful art that it contains.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it's been painless. I hope it.
You are such a bad liar.
No. It's been really, really fun.
Well, a huge thank you to David for being so incredibly generous with his time. I hope you enjoyed that. I really did. Like I said, The Masters of British Comic Art is a book that is not just a history of comics, but also it's a feast for the eyes with some absolutely exquisite artwork. So make sure you get a copy if you can. Join us later this week for the next of the Thrillcast lockdown tapes as we bring you more thrill-powered pandemic podcasting. And as I said before, Earthlets, I hope you're staying safe. See you on the other side. Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.